Of course, Paul's crisis that he was caught up in is not your crisis, not at all. But what Paul urgently needed in his crisis mode was what all we Christians need when we are caught up in any kind of crisis: reassurance that Jesus is here with us and that He's eager to help us far more than we can ask or imagine, as Paul says in Ephesians. To get the full picture of the shocking crisis that Paul faced as set forth in our text, I want you to pick up your remote. You should find it in your hymnal rack there. I want you to fast backward to about 58 A.D. in Jerusalem, about 30 years after the resurrection and the ascension of our Lord. One day on Main Street in Jerusalem, maybe it was Broadway or 10th Street, I don't know, a religious segregationist spotted Paul walking with a Gentile down the street. And this man knew that Paul had just been in the temple. And he assumed Paul had taken this Gentile with him into the holy place reserved for Jewish men. Well, this bigot spread the word, and pretty soon a brawl broke out in downtown Jerusalem, the kind of baseball brawl that broke out in Baltimore a few days ago, if you saw it on television. And he spread the word that Paul had taken Gentile into the temple. Well, Paul hadn't done that. That was a false accusation. But even if he had, so what? After all, when Jesus drove the money changers out of the temple, quoting the Old Testament, Jesus said, "My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations." Most of his listeners heard that, but it just went right on by. They just didn't get it. Well, when the riot erupted, Roman soldiers, they're under the authority of Rome, of course, at this time in Jerusalem. Roman soldiers raced to the scene, rescued Paul, and permitted him to defend himself. This is all told in Acts 22. This is interesting, I think. Luke says the mob got very quiet when they realized Paul was talking to them, not in the Greek language, but in Aramaic, an offspring of Old Testament Hebrew. And so Luke says they listened very quietly, Acts 22:2, until, after a few minutes, Paul used that nasty word, Gentiles. And the mob shouted, "Rid the earth of him! He's not fit to live!" Acts 22:22. Well, to protect Paul, the soldiers placed him in the army barracks, while 40 men plotted how to seize Paul and kill him. And then comes that marvelous verse, Acts 23:11. The following night, the Lord stood near Paul. During the night, you know, bad phone calls so often happen during the night. During the night, Jesus showed up. Nighttime can be such a sweet time when we're bone tired and we go to bed in our own bed. You know, I emphasize our own bed has never felt so good. However, when a heavy heart makes you wet your pillow nonstop, that makes for a miserable night until Jesus shows up. Just when I need him. let me change the pronouns. Just when we need Him, Jesus is near. Just when we falter, just when we fear, ready to help us, ready to cheer, just when we need Him most. Jesus showed up on a miserable night and said, "Take courage." Two great words. Jesus isn't scolding or nagging or barking out commands like an army sergeant. He's just saying, I have a good gift for you. Open your heart and embrace it. Courage, bravery, faith, so that you can overcome your fear and move on into the future, trusting a loving, redemptive God who is so experienced at bringing good out of bad. The night before the crucifixion, Jesus told His disciples, John 16:33, I have told you these things that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have trouble, but take heart. And some translations read, take courage. I have overcome the world. Today is a good day to hear Psalm 31:24. Be strong and take heart, take courage, all you who hope in the Lord. Do not allow fear or doubt or discouragement or despair to keep you from moving on. And I am confident you won't. You will move on. I am confident of that. Now, I need to ask you to pick up your remote again. And don't tell me your wife has snatched it away from you. I want you now to fast backward again, but beyond 58 AD, all the way back to about 25 AD. Okay? We're going up into the hills of Galilee to the village of Nazareth on the Sabbath and drop in at the local synagogue. And as we arrive and get settled in our seats, we begin looking over the congregation. And look. There's Jesus in His hometown synagogue. He's sitting in the back. Now, that's my way of apologizing to you folks in the back and up in the balcony if I've ever teased you for sitting back there or up in the balcony. See, in my imagination, at this point in the synagogue service, Jesus is in the back. He knows where the good seats are. When I was here as interim, this is an aside, one night we had a concert given by an American Idol Christian soloist. And when Mary and I arrived, we sat down in this second pew right over here, so proud that we're holy, and holy people sit down close to the front, And we sat right in front of a huge speaker that had been rented for the night that reached almost to the ceiling, it seemed to me. And as we were sitting there getting ready for the concert, someone tapped me on the shoulder. And I looked around, and it was a very, very thoughtful sound person from our sound booth. And he said, Wendell, I've heard you say here that sometime in some service you would love to sit up in the balcony, the whole service. He said, this might be a good time for you to do that. Thank the Lord for that man. Yeah, we moved up there. Oh, it was a great concert because we heard it real good even up there. So, we're in Jesus' hometown synagogue, and Jesus is there. And as a hometown rabbi, he's become very popular throughout Galilee, drawing huge crowds wherever he goes with his teaching and healing ministry. And so the worship leader in this Nazareth synagogue invites Jesus to come to the front and read the prescribed scripture from the prophets, prescribed for that day, which happened to be Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor, and so on. And then finishing the reading, Jesus sits down and informally dialogues with his old friends and buddies that he grew up with, some carpenter shop customers, and so on. Maybe someone who taught him in school. And with his sudden celebrity status that he's acquired, I think probably some of the people in his home, in this hillbilly town that he was from, suspect that he feels too good for us now. After all, he has made the more cosmopolitan Capernaum, which had many more Gentiles, by the way, than did Nazareth. He's made Capernaum his Galilean headquarters. Well, la-di-da. And sensing, Jesus knows our hearts through and through. Sensing their anti-Gentile prejudice. That's the only way I know to put it. Jesus reminds his lifelong Nazareth friends that although 800 years earlier than their day, there were many hungry widows in Israel. Many hungry widows in Israel. God sent his prophet Elijah to only one. And she was a Gentile. And after Elijah's day, during his successor's ministry, Elisha, although there were many lepers in Israel during Elisha's ministry, Elisha healed only one, and that was Naaman, a Gentile, a Syrian army officer. That's not all. Whose wife's Hebrew slave girl had been kidnapped by the Syrians from her Hebrew parents and transported to Syria, and my guess is she never saw her parents again. And her mistress's husband, Naaman, is the only leper Elisha healed, a Gentile. Do you get the picture? Obviously, Jesus is implying that God has sent the Messiah not just to the Jews, but also to the Gentiles. As Jesus later said in his ministry, I have other sheep, Gentiles, that are not of this fold. I must bring them too, and there'll be one flock, one shepherd. They too will hear my voice. There'll be one flock, one shepherd. I'm not sure, but at this point in this Nazareth worship service, I think I hear someone in the congregation muttering to the guy next to him, I don't care if he did grow up here in our town. Our God would not send the promised Messiah to those dirty SOB Gentiles. He wouldn't do it. So for the crime of preaching that God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, for that kind of preaching, Jesus' old buddies, his fishing pals, went ballistic, grabbed him and dragged him outside to a nearby cliff to throw him down to the rocks below and smash his bones to pieces. Can you believe that? But Luke records that Jesus, quote, walked through the crowd and went his way, his way, his way, his way to Jerusalem, his way to the cross, for those filled with the urge to kill him would get their way. Their way? Okay, but yet, God's way. God's way. So how did Jesus deal with his crisis? He courageously stayed on the path that God had marked for him. He stayed with God's calendar, and he stayed with God's will for him. Logan Street Church family, take courage and stay on track with God's will and God's plan for your future, and I believe you will. And so when Jesus showed up in Paul's cell 30 years later and more in the Jerusalem barracks, Jesus showed up as one who, like Paul, was almost lynched. And for the same reason, for loving Gentiles. Nothing infuriated Jesus' own people so much as the way Jesus loved sinners of all kinds. So, do you get it, Paul? Do you see how Jesus really understands exactly what you are going through? My goodness, where you've been, he's been there, for crying out loud. He's done that. He knows, he understands. Now, by promising Paul courage, Jesus was not promising easy times ahead. Oh no, rather quickly the Roman authorities shipped him to Rome, but on the way, as you know, they encountered a terrific storm on the Mediterranean Sea, and finally the ship sank, but all 276 of the passengers survived by swimming like crazy and surfing on boards and timbers until they arrived on the shore of the island of Malta in the Mediterranean Sea, where Paul was promptly bitten by a poisonous snake. That's not all. When they finally reached Rome, Paul was promptly put under house arrest, where he waited and waited and waited and waited for 2 years for his day in court. But guess what Paul did during those 2 long years? In addition to taking advantage of his opportunity to witness to everyone who came to see him and the guards who were there 24/7 all week long, in addition to that, Paul wrote 4 New Testament books, which I dare say you greatly treasure. Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. Think God isn't redemptive and knows how to bring good out of bad? It was a bad thing what they did to Paul in Jerusalem and what they tried to do in Jerusalem to Nazareth to Jesus. And it was a bad thing when they, sent him to Rome to just wait and wait on his heels there for 2 years, interrupting his calendar. He couldn't even go down to the corner cafe and get coffee when he wanted it, and he couldn't continue his ministry like he wanted. And yet, look what happened. The good Jesus brings out of bad. Call Paul's witness and his writings in Rome the fruit of the courage that Jesus promised Paul in his barrack cell back in Jerusalem. Of course, I don't know the road ahead for you, Logan Street, and I suspect you don't either. We never do. We never know what all God is up to. I'm sure that's good. But I believe that we all know this. Jesus is here today. He's with you. He's going to stick with you no matter how rough the road is ahead, as it was for Paul. He's going to stick with you and see you through, as the choir so wonderfully sang, through it all. Jesus is with you. That's the right text for today. While visiting relatives in Lexington, Kentucky last year, Mary and I worshiped at the Trinity United Methodist Church in Lexington, where at that time our grandson was music and worship leader. And we heard this story. It's a meltdown story from the pastor, Steve Drury. In June of 2014, a little over a year earlier, Steve's son, in his mid-20s, died from a self-inflicted gunshot. In May of 2015, looking ahead to the first-year anniversary of their son's unfortunate death, tragic death, Steve and his wife, Pastor Steve and his wife, decided they would take that week off, the year of the anniversary, first anniversary, and just get away. And somewhere, some way, in a quiet place, try to find peace. And they talked about it, and they finally settled on Charleston, South Carolina. Now, they made reservations. The day after the deadline passed, that they could get a refund if they'd changed their mind and, asked for a refund of their deposit. The day after that deadline passed, the next day was the day that 9 people were massacred in the Emmanuel Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston. And Steve and his wife immediately decided, we can't go to Charleston. They decided to cancel their reservations and just, forget about the deposit money. But they changed their minds and went. When they got there, they discovered that the place they had reserved was 3 blocks from that church, Emmanuel Methodist Episcopal Church. One day they walked over to the church and found some members on the church lawn singing and praying, filled with his son's thoughts about his son's death and gratitude for these Charleston church members and their obvious faith and courage. Steve put his hand in his face and sobbed uncontrollably. And one of the church members came over and placed his hand on Steve's shoulder and said, "Buddy, it's going to be okay." Here's the lesson. Steve and his wife wanted to get away to visit some lovely southern mansions and sit in lawn chairs and scenic spots and just talk and experience quiet and find the peace that Jesus promised. But God had better plans. In a noisy place of hatred and violence and tragedy and turmoil, the Drurys found peace in the witness of some spirit-filled people. By the way, the Sunday Mary and I were there in that worship service at Trinity United Methodist, Steve told us that at one point some troublemakers, while they were standing there, some troublemakers showed up at the church. And one of the members of the church confronted the troublemakers and asked them to leave because he said, "The seed you want to sow does not grow in this place." And is that a great line or what? The seed you want to sow does not grow here. And I don't believe at all that the seed of fear and despair will grow here at Logan Street. Because the courage giver, Jesus, is with you today and will go with you every day into the future. I believe that with all of my heart. During our invitation hymn, I invite you, if you wish to receive Jesus and confess him as your Savior and Lord, you come today, and the church, of course, will hear you and wait on you and make plans to receive you and help you in every way they can. Or if you wish to join Logan Street, move in your membership, while you come, and again, the church will take care of you and welcome you. But I also want to give this invitation. I really believe that we came here today, one reason, maybe the main reason we came was to pray, to talk to God. And if you are impressed, if it'll help you to come to the altar and either sit or kneel, whichever, and talk to God for a while. If you wish then to go back to your pew, that's fine. Or if you wish to linger here, that's fine. I just think that we should let the Spirit have complete freedom, and that you should have every opportunity to pray. You may want to, stay behind your pew there and pray there. That's fine. If you want to come forward and just pour out your heart to God, I want you to feel free to do that. The service is hopefully is in the hands of the Spirit now. Okay, Chris will announce our hymn of invitation, and you stand, please.